Ready?
Hit it!
Hello everyone and welcome to Twice Nightly the Podcast with Maria Lovelady
And Michael Alan-Bailey, a podcast that aims to bring everything variety out of the wings and into the limelight.
So what are we waiting for?
Let's raise the curtain
And start the show!
Welcome everybody, or should we say bienvenue? Was that right?
That was great. Say it again.
Bienvenue.
I feel like I'm sat with Bridget Bardot here.
Bienvenue to a very special episode where we will be shining the spotlight on one of the greatest performers of all time. No, not Michael Bailey. Josephine Baker.
Now, anyone who listens regularly to our podcast will have heard the name Josephine Baker pop up quite a bit. So we thought that we'd delve a little bit deeper into who she is and why she's still one of the most talked about entertainers nearly 100 years since she first took the world by storm. So can you remember a specific kind of light bulb moment where we discovered who she was? Because I can't. I just remember us researching our show Twice Nightly, and she was a name that came up really early on as somebody who was just a great representation of everything we wanted to put onto the stage.
I think I've always had like an idea of who she was. I think she's someone that's culturally sort of in pop culture referenced quite a lot. You've got Beyonce, you know, I'm a huge Beyonce fan, and she's done sort of like lots of tributes to her. And, you know, there's all, she's around, isn't she? But I don't think I quite knew all the ins and outs of her story. And you just kind of think she's another dancer, she's another entertainer. You don't really understand the significance of what she was doing in the time that she was doing it, and all the stuff that we're going to share with you today about her secret life as a spy. You know, none of that I knew. And I don't think I knew about her death and how, I mean, it sounds awful to say, but how fabulous it was, and the way that she went, and we'll get to that later in the episode, but I think the way that she went is the way that any performer would want to go. And I think it was that moment. I remember texting each other and saying, wow, isn't this fabulous?
I think it was probably a photo, you know. I feel like we used a lot of photos of her on like mood boards and things like that, didn't we? But I mean, if you just Google image Josephine Baker, every single photo is something that you want to investigate and you want to delve into.
And put a poster on your wall.
Exactly, because in one photo, she's in a military uniform. The next, she's in a carriage being pulled by an ostrich, which is a real thing.
And you've got these really ultra feminine pictures. You're right. I remember that picture. There's one of her and she's in a full showgirl outfit.
Yeah.
You know, the feathers, and she's so young and got this big smile on her face, and she's got the vintage curls. It's just ultimate femininity. And then your next picture will be her dressed almost in drag with the tuxedo on, the top hat, you know, hairstyles, and it's a very masculine look. And I don't think there's many people that pull off that hybrid, really.
No, definitely not. Everything about her, I think, makes you want to investigate. It makes you want to learn more. It makes you want to discover what is the reasoning behind this? What was the history behind this? What was the purpose?
And I think somebody who you look at and think, how on earth was she doing that in the time that she lived?
Exactly. So I always think that Madonna's last album, Madam X, she created this character that was like a woman of mystery. And on all the promo stuff, it was like, Madam X is a spy, Madam X is a dancer, Madam X is a cha-cha instructor, Madam X is a nun and a teacher, and all of these things. There was a really funny tweet where somebody had put Madam X as a wagon wheel. I remember somebody sending me that. That was Josephine Baker. She was Madam X. She was this figure that was so many different things.
She actually was, though, because Madonna is a character, isn't it? That is, Madam X is a character. Josephine Baker actually was a spy and actually was a dancer and actually was, you know, well, she wasn't a wagon wheel, but maybe she was. Maybe.
She was an umbrella. She was an umbrella for so many different identities. And I mean, you've just described some of the words that we used to describe her. Other words that you could use to describe Josephine Baker were she was an actress, she was a vedette, she was an activist, a humanitarian, a fashionista, an animal lover, a mother, and like you said, even a secret agent.
So Josephine Baker was all of these things, and it's really hard to know where to begin. So we wanted to speak to the best people that we could, who really can give us a sense of who Josephine Baker was.
Yeah.
And we had the pleasure to interview Nichelle Gainer, who features Josephine extensively in her fabulous book, Vintage Black Glamour. Now, Nichelle is only one of the voices that you'll hear talking about Josephine throughout this episode. And she's going to start us off by summing up exactly what Josephine Baker was.
She was a sensation. She was a sensation in the shows when she did her famous banana skirt nude on stage. Mm-hmm. She appealed to different people, and she, her life beyond the stage, helping with the French Resistance, helping donating to different charities. She did, some of the outlandish publicity things, having her pet cheetah, Chiquita, with a diamond collar. If you walk around with a cheetah with a diamond collar, people are going to pay attention to that generally.
And if there was one thing that people did, it was pay attention to her all over the world. And for decades since, I mean, look, it's 2022 and we're still talking about her now. She really was the full package. So let's get down to unwrapping some of these layers.
Josephine was born Frida Josephine McDonald on the 3rd of June in 1906, St. Louis, Missouri. Josephine lived with her mother, who'd been adopted in 1886, and Josephine adored these grandparents, and she remembers that her grandmother's voice was the first singing voice that she'd ever heard. How gorgeous is that?
It really is, isn't it? And I think it's lovely when an artist's talent comes from something as personal as that. It's nice, isn't it? So there was always a little bit of mystery around who Josephine Baker's biological father was, and it's never been solved to this day. She was raised by her mother Carrie's boyfriend, who was a vaudeville musician himself, quite interestingly. And many people believe that this guy, his name was Eddie Carson, and they believe that he was Josephine's biological father, as well as the father that brought her up. But her mother, Carrie, was the only person, obviously, that knew Josephine's father's identity, and she never revealed it until the day she died.
What I really love is something you've just mentioned, though, is that the guy that raised her, Eddie Carson, was a vaudeville musician. And again, that idea of it being in the family, like the grandmother's singing voice.
Yeah.
It's obviously something that, whether it was in her blood or not, it was in her life from a very early age, was this singing, this performing. And she was able to explore that from a very young age, because her family were extremely poor, and Josephine had a really tough childhood, and she started working as a living domestic when she was 8 years old. So Josephine really had, from a young age, that idea that you had to work for your living from a very young age, which is something it's quite hard to think about, really, isn't it? That at 8 years old, you kind of know the value of money. And obviously, the fact that her stepdad was a vaudeville performer, she will have known from a very young age that was a good way of earning a living compared to some of the other things that she was doing at the time at a very young age. But there's loads of accounts of how Josephine spent her early age. And that's something that Josephine herself seemed to encourage, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. She didn't seem to like to have one consistent backstory. She liked the mystery and she liked the enigma surrounding her early years. And I think when you know that she came from such a deprived childhood and such an abusive childhood, because obviously she started working as a living when she was very young, and these were for families that would not have treated her well. She kind of always recounted her childhood as being very, very abusive, racially and physically and all of these things. And I guess it makes sense that she would want there to be a little bit of ambiguity to her backstory. That there was this mystery that every time she told the story, there would be something a little bit different. And again, according to Jean-Claude Baker's book in 1993, The Hungry Heart, which I love, by the way, as a title. I think that's a great title because I think that really, really sums her up. When she left America and went to Europe, he said that she did everything she could to erase her early life. And a friend of hers actually claimed, Miss Baker does not like to remember, she lives in the present. I think that's so great.
It is. And I think her childhood doesn't match the glamour of the persona that she created. So there's that sort of, from a marketing perspective, you can understand that it doesn't make sense, but also just from a psychological perspective, there's probably a lot in that she wanted to forget, that she wanted to move on from.
Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit later in the episode about how she was never fully accepted in America because of her race, and Europe embraced her and saw beyond her race. And I think that, why would you want to go back to thinking about that anyway? So that kind of makes sense to me from both a human psychological perspective and the marketing perspective of the day. Because let's face it, if she was like on Instagram now, she would be an absolute social media queen. She knew, didn't she, how to portray an image, how to portray my life is fabulous. You all wish it was yours.
Now, that is so interesting that you've just said that, because I had social media on the tip of my tongue, but I was actually going to say from the opposite perspective. Do you think that she would have had as much impact now? Because I think what makes her so fascinating is the fact that we don't really know very much about her, the fact that she was such a mystery. Whereas now, social media allows us access to everybody's life. If you're a star now, the barriers have been broken. How many celebrities post videos of themselves hanging around their kitchen in joggers, in sweatpants, and it kind of dilutes the magic a little bit. So I don't know, would she have been a social media queen, or do you think she'd have played the game in the right way?
She'd have played the game. I think she would have been a bit of a Beyonce. I don't think she would have posted all the time, and I don't think she would have been like, oh, this is me first thing in the morning. Beyonce does that, doesn't she? Where she will like not post anything for 6 months and then just drop 6 absolutely perfect photos all in one go. I think she would do something like that.
I do that as well,
Yeah. We do that because we're rubbish, and then it's not really worth waiting for. Also, I think that, you just said that about living in the past. She lives in the present. I think that just sort of sums up her like joie de vivre, if I said that.
You
right.
are coming out with all these great French phrases. Honestly, it's like sat here chatting to Catherine Deneuve. I love it.
She did, didn't she? She had a love for life, and she had a love for the moment and for the present. And I think that, especially being a woman and a Black woman in that time period when everything was only getting better for women and only getting better for Black people, why would you want to live in the past? Like, just go live in the moment, because it was only, we've not quite, after this week, we're definitely feels like we're going backwards, but I can imagine there was a real feeling at that time that things were only getting better. Yeah,
definitely. Obviously, we've already established that she had quite an unusual, unconventional childhood, and that only kind of heightened in 1919 when she got married for the first time. She got married on the 22nd of December, and she was just 13 years old. The marriage was to a steel worker named Willie Wells, and it lasted less than a year. And then she married again for a second time in Philadelphia, age 15. Now, her second husband, his name was Billy Baker. So on the 17th of September in 1921, she officially became Josephine Baker. Now, on the marriage certificate, she lied about her age, her parents' names, and she claimed it was her first marriage. So even back then, even at 15, she was already starting to cover her tracks, in a sense. She was already starting to lay this foundation of an uncertain past and this mysterious life. So it's funny, isn't it, to think that even though later on people were like, oh, it was a conscious decision she made, it goes back to being a child, like she'd started it that young.
Because, I'm just like really thinking about that, because it's like she can't have known, can she then, what her life was going to become, and that she would need to sort of rewrite her past. But she was doing it anyway. She's curating an image, isn't she, from the very beginning of her life, and being seen exactly how she wants to be seen.
I think she must have known that she would be something, that she would do something. I remember seeing an interview with Bette Midler once, and somebody said, did you know when you were a kid that you were going to be this superstar? And she was like, yeah. And obviously you can't know. There must be something, mustn't there, that tells somebody I'm meant for something greater than what I have. And I think she just had that. And even if she never became famous, I think that she still would have kept her cards close to her chest and not revealed.
And being who she wanted to be on her own terms.
Yeah, exactly. So after that, she married twice more throughout her life, but claimed that almost 50 years after her marriage to Billy Baker, that I've been married hundreds of times. Every man I've ever met has been my husband. I mean, just when you think she couldn't get more fabulous. But she was also known as well for a very fluid sexuality, and she frequently engaged in affairs with women as well as men.
Yeah, because there's lots of debate about whether she had an affair with Frida Kahlo.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this stuff, you know, we'll never know and it can never be documented. And obviously, because of the times that it wasn't something that will have been necessarily spoken about openly. But I think in her circles, it was very much the way of the circles that she was mixing in. You know, they were exciting times. You know, it's 100 years ago, but actually, I think that sort of period of life, and especially being in Paris where she was, everything was just really exploding, wasn't it? And she's just a real symbol of all of that time.
Do you think that the conversation kind of gets going a little bit more because it's speculation and because there's nothing concrete and nothing fact?
I think so. But I think you can also like dilute these stories, can't you? Because of that, you can make her into whatever you want her to be of the day. So, you know, there's been movies and documentaries about her life, and because there's no facts, you can edit it and make her whatever you want her to be. But I don't think you can, you know, and we'll talk about that because there's a very exciting new series coming up about her. And I hope they include all facets of her life.
So this is a great opportunity for us to introduce our next guest, the host of the Prairie Vaudeville Podcast, Grant Simpson. And we asked Grant to tell us a little bit about Josephine's break into show business, and specifically the show Shuffle Along. Now, this was where she made her debut on stage, and it was a really, really important show, not only for Josephine, but for a lot of Black performers at the time. So let's hear what Grant has to say.
It was a different vaudeville world. The Black vaudeville circuit was different. You know, the audiences were different. The audiences were really tough. And if they liked you, they loved you. And if they didn't like you, they really didn't like you. And it wasn't easy to win them over because a lot of them are talented just in everyday life. Like they're talented dancers and singers, and a church congregation of 200, there's probably 150 good singers in there. And the same when it comes to dancing. Their culture was so inclusive of singing and dancing in their regular social lives that when you go to see somebody do it on stage, it's like you need them to really step it up. So Josephine grew up in that world. I mean, as a chorus dancer, I don't think she was ever a star in that world.
Nichelle and Grant also pinpoint exactly what it was that made Josephine stand out.
She was definitely that comedic performer that, you know, sending the clowns, whatever. She definitely had the comedy in her performance.
You can get away with a lot of things if you're funny.
Shuffle Along ended its run in 1923, and afterwards Josephine appeared in the revue The Chocolate Dandies. Now, this is something I think is really important to talk about, is the law and segregation rules in America at that time, because it was really difficult for Black performers to find work, and often Black performers would have to wear blackface so that the audience would assume that they were whites wearing blackface. And even the blackface makeup that they wore would have to be lightened to be lighter than their actual skin tone.
You can't imagine the frustration of that, can you? Like, for who you are to be suppressed anyway.
And stereotyped.
And to be stereotyped and mocked. I mean,
and then have to dress up and do it yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
You just read things like that and can't believe that it had to happen. I watched a really good documentary about this on YouTube, actually, all about the Harlem Renaissance. And I think if people want to find more about that, there's that documentary on YouTube is a great place to go, because they speak to a lot of performers that were doing that at the time. And like you say, it's not just hard to find work, but then when you get it, to have to behave like that. Thank God it doesn't happen anymore.
So a popular misconception was that Josephine got her big break on Broadway before she made herself a name internationally. But she was self-admittedly fed up with America, and she sailed over to Europe to appear in La Revue. I feel like I should leave this to you because you've got brilliant French pronunciation.
But I don't know if it's right. La Revue Notre. Is that what it is?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if that's not what it is. It's what it is now.
Send us a speak pipe if you know how that's pronounced.
So the show was on at the world famous Theatre des Champs-Élysées. Oh, go on, you take this as well.
Nigre. No, I'm just trying to still pronounce that other bit. La Revue Nigre.
And which theatre was it on, Madge?
Theatre des Champs-Élysées.
Oh, fantastic. I tell you what, I'm glad you're here.
Anyone that's in France, I apologise. Or that can do French beyond French GCSE.
And it was here at the Theatre des Champs-Élysées that Josephine met the love of her life, the city of Paris. We have been sitting on that music for over a year. That is honestly, I feel as though we've created the entire world of Twice Nightly, the show and the podcast, just so we could feature that music in an episode about Josephine Baker.
Absolutely fabulous music there from our MD, Jess Dives, who composed that music for us for our show Twice Nightly, which is a year old this week, which is very exciting. So we're very happy that we've been able to use that in this episode. And we've used it before, haven't we, in different episodes?
Yeah, no, of course. But I mean, this is the prime opportunity to use it. I mean, if you don't listen to that music and feel like you stood under the Arc de Triomphe, then we failed on all counts.
No, we have. And Josephine didn't fail. She was a success in Paris almost instantly, practically overnight. And Nichelle is back again to show why she thinks that European audiences embraced her and why Paris was a place that she could really come into her own.
I think people see themselves in her. I think over the years, hearing about her, seeing her pictures, hearing her story, I think people connect with that. It's that universal story, whether you're you're from a small town in the United States, maybe a really conservative mindset where they can't, well, what do you mean you want to be a dancer? That can't pay, can you pay bills doing that? So you leave that small town and you go to the big city, you go to Paris or London, you go to New York or LA or Chicago, and you become who you're supposed to be. And there's no one around you saying, hey, oh, you're a dancer. They're not looking. If you're in New York and you say you're an actor, no one will blink twice. Where it's not a thing. You can just be an actor. It's what you do. It is what it is. No, people think nothing of it. And the same as a writer, because they're a writer too, probably, or an actor, or So to have that freedom, that's one. I mean, you have your other issues. If you're going to be an artist of any type, of writer, producer, whatever, you have other issues that you have to do. But one of those issues is just not that societal pressure around you. You can just kind of take that off.
So it's the 20s. And she's in Paris and she's thriving and she's absolutely loving it. But she caused a bit of a stir in 1926 when Paul Devane, the manager of the Folies Bergère, asked her to come and work for him there.
This meant that she had to leave the show, La Revue Négrier, which was in Berlin at the time on its European tour. And Josephine leaving would have meant disaster for the show. It would have meant tons of people out of work. It would have meant the show closing. And Josephine knew this. So her condition was that she would only break her contract if Paul Devane paid her an additional 400 francs. And he did. And she did. And the entire production was forced to close a week after she left. And I know from reading lots of accounts in various biographies that lots of members of the company of that show were really angry, to the point where I think she received death threats and everything at one point, because it was their livelihood. And like we said, this was a show that was a great platform for Black performers and one that they didn't get very often. So I guess for them to feel as though this one person's selfish act caused a lot of people to be out of work, I mean, you would be annoyed.
But then what was that extra 400 francs then to cover some of that cost for people of the show closing?
No,
or was that
just for her, just for herself, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but there's also been a lot of talk as well in lots of accounts of Josephine Baker's life where people say she was that performer that would literally step on anyone if it meant getting ahead. She was only really loyal to herself, which, I mean,
I think that's true of most of the big stars.
I think it is, yeah, definitely. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing either. I don't think it necessarily is a bad trait, because look what she did, look what she achieved. I guess the only difference between Josephine doing it and other people doing it was that she did it and others didn't. She had the courage to do it, and look where it got her.
Exactly, and I think it was really important as well to have a Black superstar at the time, because
definitely
there weren't many in Paris at the time, and that representation was something that was seriously needed. So we've talked about that she was this famous performer and that she was someone that everybody would come to watch. But what was it, Mike, that everyone wanted to see?
Well, it was during the time that she joined the Folies Bergère, and she included this number in her act, which was the famous Danse Sauvage, which was Josephine dancing a kind of Charleston / tribal dance where she wore the famous banana skirt. She wore nothing else. She was completely nude on stage except for this skirt made of bananas. Now, this was controversial. It was headline making. It was a parody and a send-up that she understood, but she knew that there was deeper context to it than that. Although she knew the audience were laughing at it and it was
I think it was also incredibly sexy. It was also incredibly well done. Technically, she was dancing brilliantly. She was stunning. It was men and women wanting to watch her do this. So although she was playing into that parody and that stereotype, it was also a great platform for herself and for the culture. I think it's something that we definitely, as we look back with time, like this isn't done anymore and it shouldn't be done anymore. But when you look at the context of which she was performing in at the time, this was the way she was going to become a superstar.
She worked on it with George Balanchine, who was the world famous. I mean, he's still world famous for his work with the New York City Ballet. I mean, all the big ballets in New York, they're George Balanchine's. Mm-hmm. You know, still to this day, the Nutcracker that they do every year is George Balanchine's Nutcracker. So the fact that this kind of renowned classical choreographer was working with somebody in the Folies Bergère, you know, to create this dancing in its rawest form. I think it's great that those two worlds collided and that it was so well known.
You know, when she did the banana dance, it was fun. She thought it was funny and everybody thought it was funny. And the French society was into it. They loved it. I mean, the artists really loved it. The other vaudevillians really loved it, which is why, you know, the racist treatment that she got made it all the worse when she was embraced by all the artists.
And I think with a lot of this stuff that we're talking about, you have to look at it through the lens of the time. So while she may have been doing something that you think, oh, you know, she shouldn't have been playing up to that stereotype, she was almost making the situation worse. What else was she going to do? Do you know what I mean? Like, that was what was required of her. And people like Josephine Baker doing those dances, becoming world famous in front of a white audience, has paved the way for other performers to be able to do the same thing. So it's quite hard for us to judge her individually for something that was in a time where the rules were very, very different to now. And in 2016, on what would have been a 110th birthday, Vogue magazine actually described the Danse Sauvage and said that it brilliantly manipulated the white male imagination and radically redefined notions of race and gender through style and performance in a way that continues to echo throughout fashion and music today, from Prada to Beyonce. So what a legacy. Whilst being controversial, what a legacy this dance has had.
But she knew that although it was there to entertain people and to make people laugh and to be a comedy, she knew that it was getting a message across.
And if you would like to see the Danse Sauvage, it's on YouTube, because it's kind of hard to describe it, isn't it?
No, it really is. Yeah, no, it's a phenomenon in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, because she's got such long limbs and there's so much energy and power, but then she sort of slows down and goes a bit sexier. And and you know, it sounds a bit seedy that she was only in a skirt and nothing else, but it's really tasteful.
Yeah, no, very, very tasteful.
So she continued her success in Paris and eventually found her way into movies. She made her first film, Siren of the Tropics, in 1927. It was a silent film that marketed her very much as the star, and her name was actually above the title. This marked her as the first Black woman to star in a big commercially released film. So you're seeing now how big she was getting.
Talk about breaking down barriers.
Absolutely.
So she made a further 3 films. She made Zuzu in 1934, Princess Tam Tam in 1935, which I just watched recently, by the way. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And Faust Alert in 1940. Now, these films were really big hits in Europe. And by the end of the 30s, she was one of the biggest stars on the continent. But there was still that one obstacle that she just couldn't seem to overcome, and that was success in the States. So we asked Nichelle all about Josephine's success in Paris and the possibility of returning to America. And this is what she had to say.
She loved doing the movies. She had a chance to do all, with Princess Tam Tam and Zuzu. She had a chance to do different things. And I think it was exciting and interesting to her. She learned French. She met different people. I can't even imagine if I'm Josephine Baker, why am I moving back to the States for what? And I think a lot of people, a lot of her fans, especially her fans from marginalized communities, Black people, other people of color, queer people, I think that they see her and say, man, if I'm in 1920 and I get to go on stage and do this, and I get to go to these fabulous restaurants and be around these fabulous people and meet these, if I could live that life, why am I going back to Canada or America, or for what?
She did return to Broadway in 1936 as the headline star of the revival of the Ziegfeld Follies. She was an absolute flop, and she reportedly caused Fanny Brice to have a nervous breakdown in the process. Apparently, she made Fanny Brice's life an absolute hell. But that had a lot to do with the attitudes and the prejudices that Black performers were still facing in America. I mean, it was still rife at that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very famous quote that she said was that in Europe, she was dining with kings and queens, but in her own country, she couldn't even get a cup of coffee. And I think that the fact that she was a flop was, as you say, lots of prejudice, and she had the reviews saying that she was a flop. But what we don't have is what actually the audience is, how they reacted to her. Like, we will never know that because there was no recordings, and whether the show was actually any good, we can't see. But what we do know is that the people that were watching her and reviewing her weren't exactly unbiased in their reviews.
And this is what Nichelle had to say about that.
I think people look back at a Josephine Baker and look at the life she lived in Europe, and especially with all the, the analogy she gave of dining with kings and queens, but in America, she couldn't even get a cup of coffee in a hotel. And they would know who she is. It's not, famous people, they know who you are. Sometimes they want a picture or an autograph, but you can't walk through this front door. The absurdity of that thing, the absurdity of enforcing that kind of thing. You're working at some whites hotel in Atlanta and you see Josephine Baker come in, and it's your job to tell her she can't come in because she's Black.
You'd be very hopeful that she didn't have the cheetah on her right at that moment.
So we've just mentioned the famous Chiquita, the cheetah with the diamond collar, famous for terrifying musicians in the orchestra pit. But Josephine was equally as famous for having a menagerie of outrageous pets. She had a chimpanzee, a parrot, she had snakes, dogs, cats, a goat. She even had a pet pig named Albert. And do you know why the pig was named Albert?
I don't.
So, on her very first morning in Paris, the morning after she'd arrived in Paris, this really old French waiter came and knocked at her door to bring her breakfast. And he walked in and she was in bed with nothing on. And she said this old guy's jaw kind of hit the floor. And he commented on how beautiful she was. And she basically said, a compliment is never wasted on me. And this old waiter was named Albert. So she named the pig after him. And not only that, but a year later, when she opened her restaurant, Chez Josephine, she hired him as the maitre d'.
Oh, really?
There you go. So the power of a nice word.
I mean, most people would just shut the door and be mortified and never want to see this guy again. And she's there giving him a job, giving him a promotion. What a sight.
What an absolute sight. But part of me thinks, I wonder, do all these little eccentricities that she had, the animals and the nudity, the sort of the liberation that she had, do you think that went against her when it came to the Americans' attitudes towards her? If she'd have just been an African-American woman that had conformed to all the stereotypes and stayed at home and got married and had kids and worked a job, that she would have been, more accepted by the American people. The fact that she was so liberated, the fact that she was so free, the fact that she was living the life that she wanted to live. Do we think that went towards what rubbed the Americans up the wrong way about her?
Maybe. I think she would have faced problems anyway. But I think, as you say, I think maybe there's an intimidation with a woman being so empowered in the day. And when you leave the clan, so she's left America and she's gone and found her own clan, her own people, or she's living the life in the way that she wants to live, you're basically saying America's not good enough for me. Like, I don't want to live in the way that you want me to live. I think it is intimidating, isn't it? So I think that's probably why she's not welcomed back.
Yeah.
You know, ironically, it's the real American dream, isn't it? Because she came from nothing.
Exactly.
Everything was against her.
Yeah.
And she still defied and overcame every problem and setback in her way. And that is the American dream. And I think it's a real shame that probably because she was a Black woman achieving that American dream, they weren't ready to celebrate her. Had she been a white woman achieving that American dream, I think the reception towards her would have been very different.
Yeah, definitely. So Paris was the place for her to be because they were much more accepting, weren't they? They were much more willing to let her be herself.
And I just think that Paris was the place to be.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, in the 30s. Our friend Tom always says, go where you're appreciated, not where you're tolerated.
That is true. And that's exactly what she did. There you go. Thomas Hope. The only wise words he's ever said. So by the time she got back to Paris, so she left America, she went back to Paris, and it was 1939. So as you know, the world had gone to war at this point. And this is where Josephine's story takes an unexpected turn. But, you know, it is Josephine Baker, isn't it? So really, are we that surprised?
Is there such thing as an unexpected turn in this woman's life?
I don't think so. So many performers did whatever they could to support the war effort, and that's well documented, isn't it? You know, people going out, entertaining the troops. We generally know those stories. White Christmas, you know, one of our favourites. You know, that's all about that, isn't it? And Josephine did that, didn't she? So they would make the public appeals and entertain the troops, and they were the forces' sweethearts. But that's not where Josephine stopped. She wasn't happy with just going over and giving a wink and a smile to the soldiers, was she?
Absolutely not. She decided to take it one step further, and she was leading a double life as a spy for the French resistance. I mean, just the fabulosity just increases. We've cranked the level up to almost stratospheric heights here.
And I think, I mean, this shows so many things, doesn't it? It shows that she had a real heart and a passion, because she really didn't need to put her life on the line like this. So she really had a lot of integrity. You know, she was fighting for what she believed in. This is where she really sort of aligns with France, isn't it? Because she's working for this country that has taken her in, that have adopted her as one of their own. And she's saying, you took me in, and now I'm going to fight for you, put my life on the line. And also, I think it just shows how daring she is, how intelligent she must have been. So she's not your typical twirly, is she? She's not just somebody that knew how to dance and made a lot of money off it, because to have pulled something like this off, she had to have had a lot of brains.
Oh, totally. And so much courage as well. So she was enlisted into the French resistance by Jacques Apty, who was in charge of recruiting. And she was recommended by a theatrical agent who was also working as a spy for them. And actually, going on what you've just said, his words to Jacques when he was talking about recruiting Josephine was, he said, she's more French than the French. Wow. So get her in, he said, because her passion for the country is more than you'll ever get from anybody else. So that was a real reason to want to recruit her. But apparently she was really quite blasé about it. You know, she'd write coded messages on her arm and on her hands, and, you know, she'd just be really open about the fact. And when people would say, is that not dangerous? You know, you've got codes written on your arm. Like, she would just say, people would never think that I'm a spy. Mm-hmm. But as well as that, there was a really great story I read from Jacques Apty where he said she really got into the role of playing the spy, and she really loved it. He said, and one day she was describing to him a conversation that she'd overheard, or a code that she'd got. And as she was telling him, she was driving a car. He said, and her driving got kind of more and more erratic, to the point where eventually he had to tell her to pull over and finish the story before they carried on, because he was like, the way it was going, she was going to cause some serious harm.
And I love all those stories that she had, like, notes in her sheet music. She was able to get into venues because she was such a great star that you just wouldn't have thought of. And it's that thing, isn't it? She completely was just hiding in plain sight.
It's one of those things as well that if you saw it in a film, you would say, oh, that wouldn't happen in real life.
But that was Josephine Baker.
That was Josephine Baker. But what was great about this as well is that while she was doing all this, I mean, literally life threatening work. She was also still going out and doing a bit as a performer. She was still traveling around. She was performing for the armed forces, the British, the French, and even the American.
And then in the years after the war ended, so we're now approaching the 50s, Josephine boldly returned to the Folie Bergère, and her efforts and service during the Second World War meant that when she returned, she wasn't just a star anymore, was she? She was an absolute legend.
And in typical Josephine Baker style, she used this completely to her advantage. She took more risks on stage and off, and she began to fight against the more social problems that the world was facing at the time. You know, these things hadn't gone away. And it was around this time that she also segued away from the comedy clown image, and she was focusing on more serious material. You know, her comedy songs were becoming ballads and things like that. And this was where she really felt at home. She was really settling into herself. She was great at the comedy stuff. As we've said before, she really was a comedian, but she wanted to convey that heart and that passion for what she did. And this is where you see the real change in Josephine as a performer.
And the early 50s saw some quite significant events happen, didn't they, in Josephine's life? Because in 51, she was invited back to the US. So that's very significant, as we've just been talking about, to a Miami nightclub. And it was around that time that she did become involved with the civil rights movement.
So she arrived at the Cobra Club in Miami, and she refused to perform until the owner, Ned Schuyler, agreed to sign a contract that meant anybody, regardless of their color or creed, were allowed to come and watch the show, because obviously back then audiences were still segregated. So this was a big, big ask.
It's interesting because I know that story from Marilyn Monroe. So I know Marilyn Monroe did that for Ella Fitzgerald. And that's a very widely celebrated story, how fabulous that Marilyn Monroe said, oh, I'll come and sit on the front row and if you let Ella Fitzgerald sing, which obviously, because she was a Black performer, there were lots of issues around that. But I don't know that story about Josephine Baker. So again, it's like history has been edited that we remember the white woman doing this for the Black performer, but actually Josephine did it, and she had the power to do that herself as a Black performer. And I think, as we've said, we keep dangling this carrot about the new TV show coming up about her. Hopefully all of this information will become more publicly accepted.
Yeah, exactly. And what she was doing was really making waves at the time with other performers as well. And you said about Marilyn supporting Ella Fitzgerald. Well, another very famous vaudeville performer at the time came and did the same for Josephine. And Grant is going to tell us a little bit about that now.
When Josephine Baker tried to go back to the States, she got booked in Florida, and she got bomb threats, racist bomb threats, because she was going to be headlining. And Sophie Tucker found out, flew from wherever she was on tour. She announced to the press, I'm going to be there, and I'm going to be front and center watching this show every night. And if you're going to blow her up, you're going to be blowing up Sophie Tucker too. And then, Josephine brought her up on stage, and they became dear friends. And the rest is history when it came to those two. They were really close after that.
So this show was a smash hit, and the critic, Walter Winchell, brought her roses and was outside her dressing room door every night.
Now, this is a very important detail to remember for a story later on. So Walter, who was a big part of her success, actually, because he wrote glowing reviews about her. And he said in his column in the New York Mirror that she had magic and big time zing. What a great word zing is. Josephine's stance on the segregation of audiences had started to spread, and it was finding its way to live venues in places like Las Vegas and lots of others. Again, just really, really breaking down those barriers and getting things moving in the right way.
Yeah, so she was fighting lots of racial prejudice from many people in the US, but there were people that were embracing this and were really celebrating her, such as Ethel Barrymore, Evelyn Anderson, and even Eleanor Roosevelt herself.
I mean, that's a big deal, isn't it? First Lady coming and supporting you in your senior. How amazing.
I think that's a sign that you've made it, isn't it? And another sign that she's made it actually was that on May 20th, Harlem celebrated the first Josephine Baker Day with Josephine herself in attendance as the guest of honor.
She was like literally center of this whole parade that was just about her. I mean, from everything we know about her, can you just imagine how in her element. She must have been.
Most people, when that plan was suggested, would go, oh, no, not really.
Oh, no, it's a bit much, that.
Or we can have a gala or something, but no, a full parade, and she attended. And I mean, she was giving the fans what they wanted.
Now, we've mentioned about Walter Winchell and about how he was really instrumental in promoting her and celebrating her. But an incident at New York Stork Club in October 1951 ended the tour on a very, very bitter note for Josephine. Apparently, she went to the club and she waited over an hour to be served food. Now, she was pretty angry at this point and felt that part of it was due to her race. The fact that she was a Black woman, she was being deliberately kind of shunned by the waiting staff. So on her way out, she expressed this anger and disappointment to Walter Winchell, who was also in the restaurant at the time. And he didn't stick up for her. He didn't come to her defense. She was really angry about this and she was really, really upset about it. Now, Walter Winchell was a pretty intimidating and feared name in the journalist world, and he retaliated. So she kind of publicly came out against him and said that he hadn't supported her and that she felt that he'd let him down. So rather than fix this, he got very, very angry about it himself, and he retaliated by slating Josephine in a really vile tirade. He called her a communist. It was really terrible. He was really, really horrible to her. And the publicity around this saw Josephine once again vilified in America's eyes. You know, they listened to what he said and automatically assumed that she was in the wrong. And she had her visa revoked and she returned to Paris, and she wasn't allowed back in the US for 9 years.
It's just awful, isn't it?
It is. Her relationship with America is almost like an abusive relationship, isn't it? Like this institution that she wants so desperately to be accepted by, and she keeps going back to in an attempt to get validation and love from, and each time it just ends really, really badly for her. You know, it's really heartbreaking, I think.
It is, but she didn't let this keep her down, because she continued, didn't she, crusading for civil rights, and eventually her role in life went in a slightly different direction because she finally became a mother.
She did. Josephine adopted 12 children throughout her life, all from different nationalities, and they were known by Josephine herself as the Rainbow Tribe. Now, this is really, again, like we say, you know, now we look at people like Angelina Jolie, who has done this, adopted lots of different children from lots of different backgrounds. Madonna has done the same, and we see it as this really modern, forward thinking. But Angelina Jolie herself admitted that Josephine Baker doing it was the inspiration for her to do it. And for it to be done all these years ago, it still stirs up conversation and, you know, maybe a little bit of controversy now, doesn't it, when somebody does that?
Mm-hmm.
But for it to be done back then, what a big deal that was.
And I think it just goes to show, so what you were just saying about that she wanted to be accepted by America, her reasoning behind this was that she wanted to show the world that people could get on despite their race, and that not only be friends, but actually be family, be brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And she sort of created, didn't she, this mini world that she believed and that she knew was possible.
That's it.
She created that for herself. And I think it's definitely something to be admired. There's actually, again, on YouTube, a lot of footage of this. So if anyone wants to check this out, you can see actually her, she's, you know, nursing them and looking after them. She's really playing the parent role. It's not like she just sort of seemed to turn up and, you know, adopt them and go back out on tour. You can see that she's very, very hands-on with them. Because I know, you know, you've read her son's biography of her, and there's a lot of tension, isn't there, between her and her son and the other children. But I do think that at her heart, what she was trying to do was only good intentions.
Oh yeah, definitely. It is interesting though that you mentioned about Jean-Claude Baker, who was her foster son, who wrote the book about her. I've read the book, and it's a difficult read because, first of all, the book is very, very badly translated. So often it's really difficult to piece together what he's trying to say. But he actually met Josephine at a very strange time. I mean, he was 14 when he met Josephine and when she, quote unquote, adopted him. And years later, all of her other children kind of contested his status as one of her children. You know, they kind of said he wasn't a proper official member of the Rainbow Tribe. He was just kind of this usurper that came in. And I don't know, reading his book, there's not much evidence to suggest that they were wrong. He goes into a lot of detail about her life. And I mean, the research that he did was really extensive. He spoke to a lot of people, but then it'll just kind of be peppered with these passages where he kind of talks directly to her. And he does come across as kind of quite bitter. And you would assume, sometimes when you read it, you think it sounds as though he didn't like her, you know? So it's a very, very confusing book. And I think it's probably the most complicated of all the relationships that she had with her children, but maybe only from his side, because we never heard about that relationship from her. So maybe she felt that it was more cut and dry than it was. And he had lots of background problems himself with his biological parents and things like that. So I think she was probably someone that liked to try and fix people, you know, kind of take broken people, if you like, people who had similar backgrounds to herself and try and bring them into her world, which was to try and help them to flourish.
And I think, like you say, the intention's good, but the reality doesn't
always come off. Yeah.
Come off, does it? So, you know, all of this obviously attracted even more attention. And by the late 60s, she was a self-proclaimed big voice in the civil rights movement. And she was actually invited by Dr. Martin Luther King's widow to take over as the leader of the CRM, which she did give some strong thought to, but eventually she decided that the personal risks were too great. She didn't want to risk her children losing their mother. So it might not have been the perfect childhood for those children, but she definitely did have them at the center of her thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. And that must have been a really difficult decision for her to make as well, especially when you're so active in something like that, to then turn around and say, I'll carry on supporting, but I don't think I'm the right person to lead this, you know, for personal reasons. Obviously, it was to protect her children, which is absolutely the right decision. But that must have been quite a difficult decision for her to make, I think.
And at this time, her career and her health were deteriorating, and she was having a lot of financial problems, and she was nearing bankruptcy. She lost the famous chateau, and, you know, this obviously will have been a huge factor and driving factor as well in keeping her family together and keeping them safe. And fortunately, she had a lot of friends that offered to help, including none other than Princess Grace Kelly, who she did take help from. And she actually eventually moved closer to her with her children. They went into a smaller place, didn't they, in Monaco?
And at this point, she started making stage appearances again. She needed the work. And let's face it, that was where she belonged. That was where everybody wanted her. That's where she wanted to be. So that's the place that she naturally ended up.
Even though by the late 60s, she was convinced, wasn't she, that nobody was interested in her anymore and that the audiences didn't want to see her. But she couldn't have been more wrong.
And her family encouraged her as well to keep going. They said, you've got to keep doing this because audiences do want to see you. You know, she's still... At this point, she's this legend. All the work she's done with the French Resistance, with the civil rights movement, she's elevated her kind of legend status up even more.
And that was proved, wasn't it? Because she did sell out many venues in Yugoslavia, Belgrade. And I'm sure what was the cherry on top of the cake for her was that in 1973, she sold out 4 nights at the Carnegie Hall and received standing ovations every night. So it feels like, doesn't it, that America has finally come to her side.
I noticed that Josephine Baker's costumes got more and more elaborate. She was always beautiful. She's one of those ageless beauties.
And I've got to say, this is my favorite era of Josephine. I mean, there's just something about her later years that I think have a quality that is just magic. She was one of those performers that just got better with age. You know, and I feel like, especially vocally, if you listen to any recordings of her at that time, her voice is so rich and so beautiful. And she's really settled into her style and she's settled into herself. She's clearly comfortable with who she is as a performer and as a person. You know, in the 1930s, any recordings you hear of her had that real kind of tinny kind of 1930s voice that everybody had back then. You know, I call it like the Snow White voice. You know, that kind of, yeah, you know, that little shrill, like, little voice. But by this time, she had this really mature, beautiful alto voice, and it's just gorgeous. I thoroughly recommend listening to any recordings of her from the 70s. My favorite one being the recital at the festival, the Golden Orpheus, which she recorded in 1970. It's a live recording and it's just sensational.
And she's took on the role of the diva legend, hasn't she, at this time? She's there with the feathers. She's got the showgirl headdress on. She's in these tight fitting dresses. She just is stunning, isn't she? Any drag queen would just kill for that wardrobe and for that look, wouldn't they? She completely, she wasn't trying to reinvent herself as still this young thing, was she? She's stunning, she's gorgeous, but she's definitely settled into sort of her age, as you say, and who she is. And she's like, yes, I've done all of these things.
She was always really good, wasn't she, at kind of embracing the style of the time. So like back in the Dance Sauvage days, that really paved the way for like the Art Deco movement. And she was at the forefront of that. And she was a pioneer for that because at the time she was trendy and she was young. Whereas in the 70s, I feel like she really embraced the camp nature of who she was and what she did. And that was perfect for that time. She was really good, wasn't she, at gauging how the audience saw her and how she wanted to present herself, depending on what era she was in.
Absolutely. And we saw this in 1974 when she performed at none other than the Royal Variety Show at the London Palladium.
Can I tell you what I love about all of these clips from this time is it's on the recording that I mentioned, but it's on all the video clips as well. Whenever she comes out, she says hello to the audience and she does the whole, bonsoir, madame et monsieur. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And at the end, she always goes, hi, friends. Hi. And that is so perfect because you genuinely, even me sat here in 2022 watching these videos, I feel like I'm a friend.
I feel like she would have been friends with everybody.
I feel like she's talking directly to me when she says, hi, friends. And I feel as though that is genuinely how she felt about her audiences.
And that was what made her endure, wasn't it? Because in 1975, she returned to Paris and she performed in her own show, which marked the 50th year anniversary of her career, the year that she arrived in Paris, which was her greatest love.
Yeah, it was just a great celebration. It was a celebration of her life, of her career, of everything that she'd achieved.
And now, if you're a performer listening to this and worrying about Arts Council funding, listen to who funded this show.
Well, she just made a few calls, got a few little investors together. So some of the investors that funded this show for her were Prince Rainier of Monaco, Princess Grace Kelly of Monaco, and Jackie Kennedy.
Another first lady on speed dial.
The show was absolutely massive and the demand for tickets was huge as well. So much so that seats were added to the theatre, and the who's who of audience members included people like Liza Minnelli, Mick Jagger, Shirley Bassey, and some of the other names we'll hear from Michelle as she tells us what motivated Josephine to keep performing so close to the end of her life.
There's that video of her, she's being interviewed and she died the next day. So there's footage of her all the way up until the end. And she was just so excited and happy to be to be back on stage. And it wasn't about financial issues or being a star again. It's that energy that you kind of, some performers that I'm a writer. I'm not a performer that goes on stage, but some of those performers, they just get plugged in. They get on stage and they get that energy from the audience. And I think she's one of those performers who enjoyed that energy, that she got that love from the audience, especially in those days. Sophia Loren and other big stars were coming to see her because they knew this was going to be the last time you could see. So a lot of big stars, Diana Ross went to go see her at the time. A lot of big stars were in the audience in those last performances because they wanted to, and I think they can relate to it. Obviously, I know that Diana Ross wanted to play her, so that's one of the reasons she wanted to see her. But of course, you want to lay eyes on her. So that type of thing never goes away. It has nothing to do with your age or your race or whatever. If you're a performer, if you're an artist and you want to get out there and sing and dance for these people, there's an energy to it. I think that when a Beyonce is on stage, I can't imagine she's on stage thinking about money. I think she's on stage thinking about or about art. She's like performing. I'm connecting with the audience, and this is a song that I wrote, and I wanted to put this out in the world. If Lizzo's out there, Lizzo is like, yes, this is me.
So this show was a huge success, and on April the 8th, 1976, Josephine performed her show for the final time. 4 days later, on April 12th, she died after being found in a coma in bed, surrounded by glowing reviews. Now, this is what I was talking about at the beginning, isn't it? If there's a way you want to go, you've got your 50th anniversary concert, you've got stars of the day like Liza and Mick Jagger, who are the names of the day, want to spend their time coming to watch you, still performing at the height of your career, and you're just surrounded by all of these reviews saying how fabulous you are.
Because those people that we've just mentioned, I mean, they're our legends, but she was their legend. She was the legend's legend.
Exactly. And as we've said, she was paving the way for those people to come forward and have the voice that we've been blessed with to listen to today.
Just to die surrounded by glowing reviews. It's all any of us want, isn't it, really?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because again, if we're talking about like the spin on it, like how she edited her life and was mysterious in her life. I'm sure she was. I'm not saying that this was a lie, but was this a fabrication? And who fabricated that? You know, you kind of picture her in like her silk nightgown or something, just like collapsed like a silent movie star, just surrounded by these reviews. And it's like, even in death, she has this paparazzi image that's enduring, doesn't she? This mystery, and there's nothing mundane or day-to-day about that. You know, she wasn't someone that was just going to sort of rot away somewhere. Even in death, she manipulated this fabulous image. So once she died, she was the only, and still is, the only American-born woman to receive full French military honours. And her funeral was attended by over 20,000 mourners. I think to get that respect as well, this isn't just us going, oh, she did this little bit for the war and wasn't it exciting? She actually must have had such an effect for the French military to say, yes, we'll give her these honours and this is how she will be buried. And I think that's further proven to this day, because in 2021 it was proposed and agreed that she become the first Black woman to enter the famous Parisian Pantheon.
Yeah, so a coffin containing handfuls of soil from the various places that Josephine had lived was put into the Pantheon instead of her remains, because her family felt that they wanted to keep her body buried where it was in Monaco. Instead, they took a handful of soil from each of these places, put it into the coffin, and that was put into the Pantheon. So she is part of it, although her body doesn't actually rest there. They've still paid her that tribute. They've still given her that honor.
And recently as well. So this isn't something that, you know, she's just somebody that this happened a while ago, like in 2021. So literally last year, she became the first Black woman to enter that. So her vivacious life and important life still resonates today. And this is what we spoke to Nichelle about, isn't it? Why are we still talking about Josephine Baker?
I think the reason she's stuck around is, first of all, there's so much material on her because she was in Europe. So she was covered extensively. She was so free. And I mean that free as in artistically free, enjoying herself, doing exactly what she wanted to do. And I think that type of energy is infectious. I think when you are an artist and you're being forced to do something, if you're like a child performer, but your parents are the ones shoving you on stage, after a while, it's work for you. It's not fun. You're not going to give off that same energy that you want to be there. She wanted to be there on the stage. She loved it.
And she is a name that's lasted. She's endured all of these decades, and she continues to fascinate now, but also throughout the decades. I mean, we had the TV movie, the Josephine Baker story, which was made, and of course, the now infamous Unfulfilled Diana Ross project, which Nichelle is going to tell us a little bit more about.
I think that would have been so interesting to see her, Diana Ross in her prime, doing Josephine, because she had a chance to meet her and see her, and there was more. I think that for all the respect, of course, she had for Billie Holiday, I think that she had more of a connection with Josephine Baker. And that just would have been amazing to see her.
I think we were robbed of a Diana Ross film, you know.
I think it would have definitely been interesting to see her take on the character, and also made in a time when she was still remembered by more people maybe than now, because now we have the new project on Netflix that is going to star Janelle Monáe, and we are so super excited about this. It's going to be fabulous. But I think we could have had both, because I think every time when you reflect on history, you sort of reflect on it, don't you, through the lens of now. And so it would have been quite interesting to have seen. Was it like the 70s Diana Ross was thinking about doing that?
It started in the late 70s, but it went right the way through to like the early 90s. She was still talking about it. I mean, this was a long-standing thing. And I don't know, part of me gets a little bit sad that the Josephine Baker story that was made was like a TV movie. Whereas you think a Diana Ross film, that would have gotten so much attention, that would have gotten so much press, and it would have really like paid tribute to Josephine in a way that the TV movie just maybe couldn't quite reach those heights. Whereas if she'd have done it, it would have been massive, I'm sure. So that's really nice that we've got the Janelle Monáe project now coming up, which is very, very exciting, even though I'm convinced that we're bugged.
Me too. So we have been talking about this for like about a year and a half, saying that we want to do a project about Josephine Baker. Well, with Janelle Monáe being Josephine Baker. And then the next thing, like a year and a half later, we just see these press releases saying that somebody else has done it first.
And now it's one of those things, isn't it? We can't ever say it and say, you know, that we were talking about this years before without somebody saying, oh, shut up. No, you weren't.
Mike, didn't you have a dream? I think you had a dream or something, didn't you? And you were like, this has got to happen. Like, I've had this dream and we're going to do it.
I think I sent you a text or a voice note about it. I'm going to dig it out with the date on and prove to the world that this has been bubbling up in our heads for years.
But I'm sure that Netflix will do a fantastic job. It's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously in the 70s and the 90s, this story of a self-made Black female legend to them was just, you know, afternoon TV worthy. And I think the fact that they didn't even think that Diana Ross could make it blockbuster worthy says a lot about what TV execs were thinking at that time. And the fact that now these are the stories that people want to hear that are being told is, you know, just fantastic.
1,000%. Well, let's hope that this new project revives a mass interest in Josephine Baker, because she is still, I mean, to this day, one of the most inspiring, multifaceted performers who's ever lived. And like we've said, she's paved the way for so many, and we have just loved every single second of getting to talk to you all about her life and about her achievements, of which there've been a lot.
And a huge thank you to Nichelle Gainer and Grant Simpson for all their wonderful insights and wisdom and everything into Josephine's life. And we have got full-length interviews with both of them about their different projects. So Nichelle's talking about her book, Vintage Black Glamour, which is an absolute smash hit book.
We've both got it and we both love it.
Oh, it's stunning. And she's got a new book about Billie Holiday out, which we've had exclusive access to and we have in our house. And it's just amazing that we were able to get that. We are so lucky. And Grant is the host of the Prairie Vaudeville Podcast, which we absolutely devour every time he releases an episode. And they're definitely not to be missed. The full-length interviews talking about them, which we've got coming out in this series too.
If you've enjoyed our special episode on Josephine Baker today, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating or leave us a review on whichever podcast platform you're listening on. We always love hearing from you guys, so please get in touch with us on any of our social media platforms. You can get in touch with us on Facebook, Twice Nightly the Podcast, on Instagram at Twice Nightly Theatre Podcast, on Twitter at Twice Nightly Pod, on TikTok, we're on TikTok now, at Twice Nightly Podcast, or you can search for us on YouTube, just type in Twice Nightly the Podcast. You can hear all of our old episodes, and that's where you can find all of our upcoming ones as well.
And if that wasn't enough, you can actually leave us a voice message on our SpeakPipe, which is www.speakpipe.com/Twice Nightly the Podcast. And we would absolutely love to hear from you about anything that we talk about on any of our podcasts. But I think we would specifically love to hear you talk about Josephine Baker and what she means to you. If you're somebody that already has found this episode because you love Josephine, like, why do you love Josephine? We'd love to hear about that. If you've already engaged with Nichelle or Grant's work, we'd love to hear what it is you love about them. And if you've never heard of Josephine Baker before and you are just an avid fan of this podcast, and we have introduced this legend to you and you've gone on and found and discovered her work from this episode, we'd love to hear what you think as a new fan.
Do you know what I think sums up Josephine Baker perfectly, and I would advise anybody to check it out, is there is a scene at the end of Princess Tam Tam which I watched recently. And Princess Tam Tam is basically a Pygmalion story. So she plays a Tunisian girl who's, you know, working as a farmer. She's working, you know, as a goat herd and a shepherdess in this field, you know, very poor, surrounded by all the poor children, and all the children love her and all that kind of thing. You know, one of those real kind of uplifting characters. And she gets taken in by these high society people, and they decide that they're going to turn her into this princess. So at the very end of the film, they are in this club, and it's full on Ziegfeld Follies style musical number where all the dancers are kind of in black and white, doing very, very classical steps. It's so synchronized. They're all in sync. They're all, you know, not a head out of place. And they whisper in her ear, and she gets this grin on her face. And then suddenly she runs up to the stage. She kicks her shoes off, and it's like, you know, one of the shoes lands in, you know, the champagne bucket with the ice, and, you know, another like kind of knocks off somebody's toupee. And she gets to the top of the stage, which is this big spiral staircase. She runs all the way down this staircase. As she's doing it, she's ripping off this dress that she's wearing, and underneath is all this black chiffon. And she runs through the center of all these dancers. She's barefoot. She's in just like a slip and this chiffon skirt. And she starts doing this real tribal dance, a dance that she does at the very beginning of the film. When they first discover her, she does this dance where she kind of mimics a doll that they've got, like, you know, a tribal doll. And she's doing cartwheels, and, you know, she makes it very, very funny. And then she comes on at the end and she recreates this dance on stage. And there's all these, you know, Ziegfeld Folly style dancers, all prim and proper. And she's at the center of them doing this really raw kind of earthy dance. And what's brilliant about it is they cut to loads of reaction shots from the audience, and every single member of the audience is beaming at her. Nobody is outraged that she's stormed the stage. Nobody's outraged that she's doing this tribal dance, or that she's lowered the tone of this place, or whatever. They are all thrilled, and they are all absolutely in love with her, and they're enraptured. And at the end, she gets this huge cheer, this huge round of applause. And, you know, I'm sat here watching it in tears. And that, to me, completely encapsulates who she was, what she was about, and why she was so special.
I couldn't agree more. All that's left for us to say is,
à la semaine prochaine. See, I got there in the end.
You're doing a me. And the full package, they didn't pay attention to her.
I went to Central School of Speech and Drama, you know.
Drama.